There's a version of you that nobody respects yet. Not because you're not smart enough. Not because you haven't suffered enough. But because every time the world tests you, you still answer. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the loudest one. It never was. This is a story about what happens when someone finally stops reacting, and what they became because of it. Ezra grew up in a city that never let anyone be invisible. It was the kind of place where reputation was currency, where what your neighbor thought of you determined whether you got work, whether people greeted you, whether you belonged. And Ezra, he cared. Maybe too much. When someone spread a rumor about his mother, he tracked them down. When his friend got cheated at the market, Ezra became the argument. When strangers disrespected his neighborhood, he became their problem. People admired how fiercely he stood up, but privately, they feared being near him. Because wherever Ezra went, conflict followed. Not because he created it, but because he absorbed it. His uncle once said something that Ezra didn't understand for years. You're a mirror that refuses to look away from ugliness. Sooner or later, Ezra, it starts to become you. Ezra laughed it off. He had no idea how right that would be. It started at a job. Not a glamorous one. Just work. Real work. The kind of place where men spent 10 hours a day side by side. And someone always had something to prove. His co-worker's name was Marcus. Marcus was the kind of person who tested people for sport. He'd poke until he found something tender. And then he'd press. With Ezra, he found it quickly. You work hard for a man who'll never give you what you're worth, Marcus said one morning. Loud enough for others to hear. Ezra clenched his jaw. You talk a lot for someone who hasn't done half of what I've done. Marcus smiled. That was the reaction he wanted. And it began. Day after day. Small provocations. Little needles. Comments about Ezra's family. His ambition. His neighborhood. And every single time, Ezra answered. With words. With heat. Sometimes with his fists shaking at his sides. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Ezra wasn't getting stronger from these fights. He was getting hollowed out. He'd drive home tense. Eat dinner in silence. Lie awake at 2 a.m. replaying conversations. Thinking of sharper things he should have said. He was losing, not to Marcus. He was losing to himself. One evening, Ezra's daughter ran to him when he walked through the door. She was 7. She had his eyes. She climbed into his lap and looked up at him with that pure, unguarded love that only children give before the world teaches them to guard it. Daddy, why do you look like that? Like what? Like something's eating you. 7 years old. And she saw what Ezra couldn't admit to himself. That he was being consumed. Not by Marcus. Not by the job. By his own inability to let things pass through him. Without catching fire. That night, he sat at the kitchen table long after everyone went to bed. No phone. No TV. Just the sound of the house breathing around him. And he asked himself, honestly, for the first time, what am I actually protecting? Because he'd been telling himself it was about dignity. About respect. About not letting people walk over him. But sitting there in the dark, he realized something. Every time he reacted, he wasn't protecting himself. He was handing himself over. There's a concept in behavioral psychology that most people never encounter. It's called the arousal trap. When someone provokes you, your nervous system doesn't ask whether the provocation matters. It doesn't weigh consequences. It just fires. And the person who provoked you, they now control your internal state. Without touching you. Without needing anything from you. They pulled a string, and you danced. Think about the people who have ever gotten inside your head. The ones who still live there rent-free. The ones you're still having imaginary arguments with at 11 p.m. They didn't break in. You left the door open. Every reaction you gave them was a key. Every time you engaged, you handed them more of your mental real estate. Ezra spent 3 weeks just watching himself. Not trying to change. Just watching. He noticed how he tensed when Marcus walked in. How he preloaded arguments before they even started. How he spent energy defending against attacks that hadn't happened yet. He was fighting a war in his own mind, and Marcus was barely involved. So he tried something that felt almost impossible. He stopped answering. Not dramatically. No announcement. No confrontation. He just stopped feeding the fire. Marcus tested him the very next morning. A comment about his work. Loud. Public. Ezra felt it. The old surge. The familiar heat rising up his throat. But this time he let it rise and pass. Like a wave that crashes and pulls back into the ocean. He said nothing. Marcus tried again, sharper. Ezra looked at him. Not with anger. Not with contempt. Just a look. The kind of look that says, I see exactly what you're doing, and it means nothing to me. Marcus didn't know what to do with that. Because provocateurs don't want silence. They want noise. They want you loud, unsteady, off balance. Because that makes them feel powerful. Silence doesn't give them anything to stand on. Over the next few weeks, something shifted in that workplace. Marcus's comments got fewer, quieter, like a speaker someone turned the volume down on. Not because anyone asked them to, but because the crowd stopped paying attention. And Ezra started sleeping again. He started finishing full meals. He started actually hearing his daughter when she talked to him. Not because his life got easier, but because he stopped leaking his energy into places it could never fill. Here's what most people get wrong about emotional strength. They think it's about having more fight in you, more anger, more resolve, more willingness to go harder. But real emotional strength, the kind that actually builds a life, isn't about more. It's about less. It's about knowing which fires are yours to put out, and which ones were set to distract you from what you were supposed to be building. The people who change the world, the ones who build things that last, who raise children who aren't broken, who move through difficulty without becoming bitter, they all learned one thing the hard way. Not every invitation to war deserves your RSVP. Some battles are engineered to keep you small. They're designed to keep you reacting instead of creating, to keep you defending instead of building. And the cruelest part? They work even when you win them. Because the energy you burned winning a pointless argument is energy you can never spend on what actually matters. Ezra understood this the night his daughter asked him a different question. She was 8 by then. "Daddy, how come you seem lighter now?" Lighter. Like something fell off you. He smiled. Something had. 2 years later, Marcus was still at the same job. Still setting the same traps for whoever was new. Still measuring his worth by how many people he could unsettle. Ezra had left. Not with drama. Not with a final speech. Just quietly. Purposefully. He'd spent those 2 years of mental quiet, doing what he could never do when he was at war with himself. He'd built something. Small at first, then not so small. And he thought about his uncle's words, the ones he'd laughed off years before. A mirror that keeps reflecting ugliness eventually forgets what light looks like. He finally understood it. Not as a warning, as a direction. You are not obligated to be a battlefield for other people's chaos. You are not required to validate every accusation with a defense. You are not weakened by your silence. You are sharpened by it. Because every time you choose not to react, you're making a quiet decision about who gets to own your interior life. And when you stop giving that away freely, when you guard your attention, your energy, your emotional state, like they're the most valuable things you possess, they become exactly that. I want to ask you something honestly. Right now, this week, is there something burning in you that someone else lit? An argument you're still replaying? A comment you can't shake? A person living in your head who doesn't pay rent? What would happen if you just closed the door? Not because they deserve to go unchallenged, but because you deserve to be free.